The chapter has ended a story that only just begun. First the rise and then the fall. These are lyrics from Don't Let It End This Way, one of the last songs recorded for the timeless 1988 album Turn Back the Clock by Johnny Hates Jazz. These lyrics in a way are quite representative of the trajectory of the band. Now, many of you might remember Johnny Hates Jazz as the Anglo-American trio featuring Clark Datchler, Mike Nocito, and Calvin Hayes. It seemed like their disappearance from the music scene was as rapid as their rise. The band's signature single Shattered Dreams continues to get tons of radio airplay today across the world, despite having released over 30 years ago. The band's short-lived story in the 80s left fans wanting more, but it seemed like that was never going to happen. Well, not until 2013, when the band reunited as a duo featuring Clark Datchler and Mike Nocito. It seemed like one of the most unlikely reunions, and yet it happened. The result of that reunion was Magnetized, an album that had retained all the essential elements that made Turn Back the Clock a milestone for sophisticated pop music. The album also marked an expansion of the band's sonic template, thus providing a glimpse into how the two members had evolved musically in the interceding years. I imagined that Magnetized was a one-off and that the band would go on an indefinite hiatus. Fortunately, that is not the case. Johnny Hates Jazz is slated to release Wide Awake, their first new album in 7 years, and today, I have the privilege of interviewing Clark Datchler from Johnny Hates Jazz to discuss his new album. Clark, I have to ask you, how are you feeling this week? You're a few days away from the first Johnny Hates Jazz album in 7 years. Nervous, excited, where's your head at?
My head's in a weird place, and I'll tell you why. We finished the album last autumn, maybe winter. I think it was autumn, actually. So, On one hand, in a sense of communicating with the public, my presence is very much with this album and giving it its chance to communicate with people. Because I often say, Pranav, when I'm talking to people, that music is all about communication. I mean, I think we're led to believe by the way music is reported often that it's about celebrity and it's about money and accumulation of wealth and ... But I think for most people involved in music, even the ones who have done incredibly well, who are seen to be, the arbiters of being involved in it for money, I think actually they just want to communicate. They just want to say, this is what is on my mind, this is what is in my heart. So, I want to give Wide Awake that chance now. That's what we've worked hard to do. But creatively speaking, I'm down the road now. I'm working on something else. I'm now building another project, another musical journey, whatever that is. But so I was really contemplating that this morning, that I could feel the pull to write something new now, and which I've started doing. So it's a really odd time, because I'm very attached to Wide Awake. I was attached to Magnetized. I was attached to Turn Back the Clock and all the stuff I did in terms of it as being a solo artist. But I think that's the funny thing. You must have found this when you ask an artist what's the best thing they've ever done. They always say it's the thing they're working on at the moment, which is probably not true, but it's how we feel. So there you go. That's my slightly long-winded answer, Pranav, to your straightforward question.
No, that's great. Now, Clark, I think it's been around 9 years since we last interacted in an interview setting.
Good heavens.
And at the time, it's been, I don't know how time has gone by, but at the time, both you and Mike were toiling away in the recording studio working on the Magnetized album. And to say that the album was brilliant and a really worthy successor to Turn Back the Clock would be quite the understatement. But now I'm curious, I'm really curious, what about the experience of recording that album and the reception of that album made the two of you decide that Magnetized would not be a one-off, and it would in fact herald the beginning of a new chapter for the two of you as Johnny Hates Jazz?
I don't think that we actually made a concrete decision that it would be some kind of new beginning. I mean, the decision was really, we'd make the album, and it whenever we've done anything, me and Mike, and this is true of when, Calvin was with us, we always thought in terms of longevity, just because when we grew up, we listened to artists who had longevity.
Yeah.
The idea of artists not having longevity is quite a recent phenomenon in the grand history of music. All of my musical idols had already been played for many years by the time I heard them, and continue to be played now. So I think that actually after Magnetized and after the fact that I became very ill whilst we were promoting Magnetized.
I remember that.
Yeah, there was a sense actually of, I mean, maybe this isn't the right comparison to use, but it's like a punch in the stomach. You know, of course, I had a rare form of stomach cancer, so I used that term very acutely, because what it did was that it ended the momentum we had built for years to get to releasing Magnetized, because I had to recover. So actually, in some ways, we were kind of in this no man's land of allowing me to recover, deciding we needed to focus on live performing to kind of gently get me back into it.
Right.
And one thing led to another, and I think that our first sense with Magnetized was that we hadn't done what we'd wanted to do. It hadn't achieved what we'd wanted. But as the years went by, we saw that it kept selling, and kept selling and kept selling and didn't tail off. So by the time we got to do Wide Awake, our impression was it was that actually Magnetized did pretty well.
Yeah.
It's just it's not in the realm of wham bam, here's a hit, and the rest is history.
Sure.
It was a slow burner, and so I think from that perspective we realized, well, there are people who really want to hear from us, and we've just got to continue to try and find them.
Right. That's a good reason to continue. It's funny, when I started playing Magnetized on high rotation, I got a letter from a listener in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she's like, "Hey, I heard this song on your station. It's by this new band called Johnny Hates Jazz. Oh, it's fantastic. You have great taste in music." And I remember writing back, and I was like, "They're not a new band. Trust me, you know exactly who they are. Just go ahead and look them up again. You will join the dots in your head." So
that's so cool.
I thought it was pretty funny. Now, Clark, Magnetized, in my view, retained the elements of what I thought made Turn Back the Clock a masterpiece, but it was by no means a rehash of Turn Back the Clock. So in view of that, and in the context of the new album Wide Awake, walk me through the conversation that you and Mike had, in which you asked each other the question, where do we go from here sonically and thematically as Johnny Hates Jazz?
You mean after Magnetized?
After Magnetized, absolutely.
Well, the conversation was quite simple. We felt that we didn't want to make another Magnetized, not because we don't think highly of Magnetized. Yeah. I mean, it's very high up on my list of albums that I've done that I feel really positive about. It's very high. And interestingly, for anyone who follows Johnny Hates Jazz on Facebook, they will have seen a montage of videos recently that I put together, which is basically asking people, what's your favorite video? And that went from Shattered Dreams to Spirit of Love from the Wide Awake album. And I remember watching it through myself when I put it together, and we got to Don't Say It's Love, which is personally my favorite video.
Yeah.
And then it transitioned to Magnetized, and I thought to myself, wow, Magnetized sounds great. I'd not really listened to it in that context before. It sounded great. So in some ways, there was an argument, you could say, of doing Magnetized Mark II. But I think a lot of years had gone by. The music world has changed so much. And we felt that the reception we got, albeit influenced by the fact that I'd become ill and we couldn't promote it anymore, we felt that it was such that we needed to do something a bit more personal. Yeah. And so I was the first one to say, you know what, Mike, at some point we should just make an album where we allow ourselves to be influenced by the music we listened to when we were growing up. And because that's really how Mike and I bonded when we were younger, when we first started working together, pre-Johnny Hates Jazz, it was the fact that we shared some musical tastes in common very strongly. I mean, we were both huge Steely Dan fans. We were huge Doobie Brothers fans, Stevie Wonder. There was a lot of common ground there, Daryl Hall and John Oates. And so as soon as I started saying that, it was like, you just had to kind of press a button in Mike and he's there. He's like, wow, that would be such a rewarding experience for us.
Right.
So as we started to slowly, throw that idea around, I had already come up with some song ideas, which were definitely, they were definitely kind of an expanded version of Johnny Hates Jazz, let's put it that way. But they weren't specific. They wouldn't be necessarily something you'd recognize from Turn Back the Clock. But I tell you what, Pranav, I am giving you a slightly long-winded answer. In that process of coming up with songs and just seeing, well, what kind of fits with what we're talking about doing. One song I came up with is a song called No Mistakes, which is on Wide Awake. And No Mistakes is the heir apparent to Magnetized? It was meant to be that. Whether the recording has ended up being that is another question, but really the public have to make up their minds with that. But the song, without a doubt, is the heir apparent. And that was quite an early song. And it was at that point we were playing with Magnetized and trying to find a way to record it, because we went through different versions of it, that we could have gone one of two ways. We could have gone down a traditional Johnny Hates Jazz route, because Magnetized is the most traditional Johnny Hates Jazz song on the album. Sorry,
sure.
No Mistakes is the most traditional Johnny Hates Jazz song on the album.
Yes.
Or we surround it in something else. And we hadn't really come to terms with what we were going to do. We were just playing around with Magnetized. I had some other song ideas. They could have gone in any kind of direction, because I'm a firm believer that your arrangement and your production is going to determine really what character the recording has. The song is the song. The song is me on a piano, and that's what it is. And what happened was... Are you sure you want me to continue?
This is great. I love this. I love this. And I'm so glad you brought up No Mistakes, because I'm going to make a reference to that song later in the interview.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because I'm going somewhere which I've done over 50 interviews for Wide Awake now, and they're mainly UK. And so I'm going into a territory I haven't been before. Essentially, I had, in the process of beginning to write again, as me and Mike were touring as Johnny Hates Jazz, and having a lot of fun doing it, I reached a point where I was asked to co-write a Mike and the Mechanics album called Let Me Fly.
I remember that.
Yeah. So I co-wrote that with Mike Rutherford and, to a degree, Andrew Roachford, one of the singers in the second itineration of Mike and the Mechanics. And I have always found it difficult to write with people. I've never enjoyed it. I've tried a few times. It's not who I am. I don't like writing for other people. I don't like writing with other people. It makes me sound like a real curmudgeon, doesn't it? But it is just how I am. I'm quite solitary in that way. I mean, when I did the songs on Turn Back the Clock, my songs, I was very solitary in how I did those. In fact, I am in the room where I wrote those songs, and I'm sitting in front of the piano that I wrote those songs on. I'm looking at it now.
That's so cool.
So I remember it very clearly.
Yeah.
So the experience, though, with writing with Mike Rutherford and with Andrew Roachford, and to a lesser degree with Tim Howard, the other singer in Mike and the Mechanics, all lovely people, but especially Mike Rutherford, was enjoyable. I was able to let go of saying, I only write for myself, and just say, you know what, I've always loved Mike and the Mechanics. Silent Running was one of my favorite tracks from the 1980s.
It's a great song.
Great song, yeah. And I thought, I'm just going to go with this. I'm going to give it my best shot, and understanding that this has to be Mike Rutherford's call. He's got to like what I'm coming up with and what ideas I'm coming up with. So I think it was after that I thought, you know what, with the right people or the right person, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could do this now and again. Yeah. I'd never be a jobbing songwriter. Couldn't hack it. There are plenty of people better at it than me. So it was me who, I think, said to Mike, why don't we get together with Phil Thornalley? Yeah. So quick bit of history that you're aware of already, Pranav. Phil replaced me in Johnny Hates Jazz when I left in 1988. And Mike and Calvin went on to make another Johnny Hates Jazz album called Tall Stories, which Phil co-wrote most of and sang. So that might sound like a really odd suggestion, but I'd known Phil for absolutely years before then. Mike and Phil were best friends growing up. So there was never any kind of, he was the guy who replaced me. Yeah. But we were friends. So, Phil has become much more of a songwriter for other people, as well as doing his own recordings. And so we thought we'd try it out. And we tried it out, got together. It was lovely seeing Phil. We had a lot of fun. And we did a track called Free, which is on the album. And it was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's different. But it wasn't complete. So we kind of hit a bit of a wall very early on. How do we complete this? So Phil then sent me a beginning of a backing track that he'd never done anything with. And I'm playing it in my car. And I start singing a song idea that I'd had years ago over the top of it. And the song is called Spirit of Love. Yeah. And as I was singing it, I was thinking, you know what? The attitude is right. With some chord changes and re-records and, just kind of approaching it from scratch. This is kind of interesting. So we got together again. I said me and Mike and Phil have a WhatsApp group, and I said, listen, I've just come up with a kick-ass idea of an old idea I had a while ago. Let me sing it to you. So we gathered at Phil's studio and Spirit of Love came together in a couple of hours. Not the recording, but the song. It's like suddenly all the different bits and pieces came together very quickly. And it was at that point that we thought, okay, we can definitely do some more things here. Now, the album Wide Awake ended up being kind of an amalgamation of things. Phil was involved in some songs more, some songs less, 2 songs not involved in at all. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it created a new dynamic. And I think that both me and Mike felt that we had labored over No Mistakes so long. We really, just he and I had spent so long and so many arduous recording sessions doing it that we felt we needed to create a new dynamic so we didn't put ourselves through that again. And so that's the very long-winded conversation that we had.
That's very interesting, Clark, because, what I'd envisioned that the two of you may have done and said, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to figure out, do we want to deviate from Magnetize? Do we want to build on this? Do we want to take a new direction? But I find this interesting that, and correct me, Clark, if I'm misinterpreting this, but it almost seems like this style evolved organically from your choice, from your very conscious choice of wanting to work with Phil. Would that be a fair interpretation?
I don't think so. And that's the reason I say that, Pranav. I think Phil was a choice that we made for certain songs because Phil shares a similar taste in music as me and Mike had from our youth. It was more that this idea that Mike and I have been kicking around for a while, why don't we do an album where we just allow ourselves to be influenced by the music we grew up listening to? And to be honest, we've got a 9-song album now, Wide Awake. That's nowhere near long enough or expansive enough to incorporate all we were inspired by. And what we ended up with some songs being more overtly inspired and some songs less. But that was the crux of it. It was really just, okay, what's our starting point? And really the starting point wasn't, let's go and work with Phil. It was more me coming out of the Mike and Mechanics situation and just saying, you know what, I kind of think we should do something with Phil, just see what happens. And that's what happened, yeah.
Fantastic. Now, Clark, I've had the privilege of listening to the entire new album, Wide Awake, a countless number of times. And it became this very sort of unlikely companion of mine, and it became this avenue of escapism during the semi-lockdown weeks in New York City. And I really do think this just might be the album of 2020. I know I said this about Magnetized in 2013, but I sincerely believe this about Wide Awake. And it really is essential expansion of the Johnny Hates Jazz legacy. Clark, I do feel like the album has a very distinct side A and side B demarcation from a thematic perspective. And in many ways, I think there's a lot of social commentary that dominates side A. Not a surprise to me at all, given some of your responses to interview questions over the last few years. You really have written an album that speaks to the times that we're in. And in view of this, Clark, given the heavy themes in what I call side A or tracks 1 to 5, did you feel a pressure to compensate with something lighter on the latter half of the album? Or, you already mentioned Free and No Mistakes, but did the other two evolve rather naturally?
Yeah, actually, it's a really interesting question. It wasn't that we felt we needed to be lighter. Knowing me, I would have gone all the way, every single track.
Okay.
But do you know what? Mike had reached a point where, he was with me on that. I think we both felt that as much as I like banging on about, socially relevant lyrics, it's still got to have a great melody. If it doesn't have a great melody, it's not going to communicate. And really what happened was that as we went through that process, just other ideas sparked that were just good. The last song on the album, My Old Piano, is a million miles away from anything that's socially relevant, but it just somehow had this character that completed the album, which basically said, at the end of the day, this is actually what it's all about. It's me sitting at a piano, and that piano, or those pianos, I've got 2 actually in this room right now, it's in some ways my closest companions. They are where I go to find solace. And so it was just, those are the ideas that came. It wasn't meant to be demarcated by, a certain number of songs with this intensity and a certain number of songs with a different intensity. But I can understand what you're saying. The way the track order has worked out,
yeah,
it does come across that way. Although No Mistakes in some ways is the heaviest subject on the album. It's just much more personal.
Sure. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I was going to get to that in about a minute. I want to really dig deep on No Mistakes.
Okay.
But yeah, it does strike me as deeply personal, and I actually had a question about it, because I kept trying to read through the lyrics of that and make sense of it. Now, before I get to No Mistakes, I have my own views on why I think Wide Awake was the appropriate title track for the album, but I'm curious to get your take on why Wide Awake was the album's title track.
Wide Awake was if I'm correct in saying this, I think Wide Awake was either the last track we recorded or it was nearly the last track. And when we were working on it, and Wide Awake was one of the tracks which was, there was me and Mike really, we started it with Phil, and then me and Mike kind of took it a lot further. And it changed a lot in that process. The two of us just love that track. Wide Awake there's something about it that we both keep saying it to each other. It's like, that's the it track for us. There's something about it that it may never be a single, but it's a bit like, it's nothing like this, but it's a bit like Don't Say It's Love is for me with Turn Back the Clock. Don't Say It's Love is just such a solid track. There's nothing, no one can shoot that down in any shape or form. And if they do, they're mad, whereas you can take pot shots at other things. That's fine. But Wide Awake is there's a lot of heart in it. It's very honest. It's very much me actually singing to myself, saying, the more digitized our lives become, the more I've got to keep slapping myself awake that what happens behind that screen is not what's really happening out there in the big wide world. It's an interpretation of what's happening. And interpretations can be colored, can be skewed, can be clear as well. But it became also this sense of, we're all in this. I'm not trying to tell people they've got to stay wide awake. I make a point of saying, in the song, of saying, we've got to stay wide awake. We're all in this together. So, and the fact that, asked me if we were going to include a sax on this album. In the process, I would have said, no, don't want sax, no. Horn section maybe, but a sax solo, nah. And then that's what we did, and it just works great. So
it sounds beautiful.
Thanks, man. Thanks. So I kind of felt that the title felt appropriate. It encapsulated the general perspective of the album, I think.
Perfect. Now, I want to discuss 3 specific tracks, Clark, with you. And the first one is track 4, which is a fantastic song called Greater Good. And the song has the following lyric. Well, it's a crazy time, and that's a fact. The world is full of egomaniacs. They want to be the biggest and the best. To pass the test, they will damn the rest. Clark, I hate to put you on the spot here, but who did you have in mind when you wrote this?
I think, unfortunately, it would be very easy to say, of course I had, one of the current populist world leaders in mind, and, and it'd be easy. They're easy to take pot shots at because they're such, glaring targets. But unfortunately, I think it's a commentary on society in general. I think there's still an awful. I mean, I could have. You could then talk about CEOs of tech companies. It's really hard to know. I just feel that this sense that we're not in this together. We're not a global people fighting global challenges is going to be our undoing. And I have to say, the swing towards nationalism or the swing towards identity politics, and when I say identity politics, I'm really referring to identifying yourself with your race, gender, religion, whatever it is, instead of, first of all, saying we're humans.
Yeah.
All the other things come later. I'm actually really quite concerned, and having, living in a country which is just going through this painful process of extricating itself from the rest of Europe. I'm seeing firsthand that, this can have very serious ramifications. Let me also flip this on its head, Pranav. Mm-hmm. I feel that we're also, when I was younger, so let's go back to the 1980s, it was seen as an absolute anathema to advertise a brand or to have your music in a commercial, in an advertisement.
Of course. It was called selling out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember and of course, you can argue that we we were able to sustain ourselves financially because we sold physical records.
Sure.
And there was a huge market for it then, and that's gone now. Now everyone, many people anyway stream, and the revenue is just not there for most musicians. So you can say, well, it wasn't, it's a luxury attitude to have back then because we didn't depend on it financially. But I'll never forget when Sting, who I think is one of the great artists of all time, he crossed that barrier when he did an advertisement for Jaguar with Desert Rose.
I remember that.
Yeah, and I remember watching it and thinking, this is the beginning of a very slippery slope.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked that he did it. Didn't need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, we're now in a time when I read this, I think, in one of the British papers, The Guardian, talked about how advertising now is the very air we breathe.
Yeah.
We call people, influencers.
Sure.
In social media. And to me, actually, why don't we call them salespeople?
Yeah.
That's actually what this has become. It's about people who do gain influence, probably for sometimes very good reasons, sometimes very innovative reasons, who are then approached by corporations, and they become their own individual salespeople of those products. And I'm very concerned that the move is now towards just the individual and not the collective. And I think, just for example, the fact you can't use the word socialist in certain parts of the world without being accused of being a communist.
Yeah.
Well, socialist is just a political term for a system that actually does operate within capitalism. It's just a fairer, compassionate form of capitalism, in my opinion. How it's actually brought into being by individual governments is another matter. And of course, any kind of system is open to exploitation and corruption. But I think we've all seen with the pandemic the power of working together to overcome issues.
Mm-hmm.
So
very, very true.
I think we've just got to see ourselves now as making decisions as a global people. You can't have Bolsonaro in the Amazon, making decisions about, mass deforestation there and it not affect the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there are certain things now. I know Modi's made a move to deforest a very ancient forest in India for coal mining. And, this is happening everywhere. I'm not just focusing on these two places. They're easy because they're huge swathes of forest. But we've got to be thinking differently. We've got to be going beyond our own borders and our own national identity. So that's really what Greater Good is about.
That's very interesting because, Clark, I have to admit, when I listened to the song, New York was at its absolute worst in terms of the pandemic. And there were interesting dynamics going on at the state level versus the federal level. And your lyrics felt eerily prophetic. And that's why I've asked you the question in the way that I did. I said, oh my God, who was he thinking about when he wrote this? It feels very timely for that exact moment.
Interesting.
So, hence the question. Now, Clark, I wanted to talk about No Mistakes since you brought that up a couple of times. I think it's a fantastic moment on the album. And I love the Aha-esque keyboard intro melody. And, it really sort of grabs you. Now, melancholic undercurrents are, in my opinion, very much central to the Johnny Hates Jazz brand. But I think No Mistakes takes a rather different look at relationships wherein it questions whether or not free will is at play in the context of our relationships. And I have to admit that as I listened closely to the lyrics, I couldn't really tell if the song was about a breakup or a demise. Care to shed light on this?
Well, I think it's kind of dangerous in some ways when songwriters start explaining away their thought process behind a song, because really you want it to be open to interpretation to a degree. So people feel they can possess that song and make it their own. A great example is Shattered Dreams. I only recently told anyone that Shattered Dreams was actually about the music business. I'd never said that before, because if you say that, it's for people who are not familiar with the music business, it's a bit alien. What I will say about No Mistakes is that in the song, I asked the question. It's very important to state that. It's a question, not a statement. Could it be that maybe there are no mistakes and that everybody's heart has got to break? So the nature of a broken heart can be for many reasons. It can be the end of a relationship. It can be the end of a life.
Yes.
And in that sense, No Mistakes is purposefully slightly ambiguous. But the song starts with, I try to find a reason for the never-ending pain. If this is God's intention, then he's got to be insane. I promised I would do my best to keep you safe from harm. So why have you been taken from my arms? And that probably indicates where I was going. It was the fact that, looking at people who have gone through the ultimate loss of saying farewell to a loved one and asking themselves the question, why? Yeah. Why did that happen to me? And I have no answers for that. But I think the idea, that what I've often wondered about, and I do think people who lose loved ones sometimes ask this question, was there a higher purpose behind that happening? Or was it just tragic? And I don't have an answer to that, but I was mulling this over. If there is a higher purpose, then what degree of free will do we have in our lives? Yeah. And I thought that was actually and it came up with the title, No Mistakes. And I thought, wow, that's something that I've needed to do for myself when I've looked at my own life and said, I think I've made mistakes here and there. Right. But then you look at the result of the mistake, and you go through a part of your life which is actually very fulfilling that you wouldn't have done had you not made that mistake. And you start thinking, well, actually, what is a mistake? I'm someone who definitely wrestles with carrying the weight of my own mistakes around with me in my psyche and my heart. And I think that need to say to myself, well, actually, you keep referring to these things as mistakes in your life, but what if they weren't? What if actually they led to something that you needed to do, or I needed to do for myself, for my own self-evolution? And I think that's really where I was coming from with No Mistakes.
It's a great song. It's definitely a personal favorite of mine, so thank you for that. That's
cool.
Now, Clark, this interview wouldn't be complete if I did not mention what my absolute favorite song on the album is. And, my apologies in advance if this makes me look musically shallow. And, and that song is Don't Stop the Music. I think this could be the song of 2020 for me. And this would end up on party playlists if social distancing wasn't a thing this year. I still think it can end up on those playlists. But I do find it interesting that in the midst of a thematically serious and heavy album, you managed to fit in something so awesomely escapist. I mean, this is without a doubt the album's stylistic deviant. What inspired the song?
Well, weirdly, it was unlike No Mistakes, which No Mistakes is one of two songs that I just wrote on my own, by the way. I should say that's quite important.
Yeah.
Because that's partly why it sounds so Johnny Hates Jazz-esque. The other being New Day Ahead. But Don't Stop the Music was a collaboration with Phil, and Phil had this groove in mind. And as we were talking about what the song was going to be about, I had mentioned that, I was working on a environmentally oriented song, which is the new single New Day Ahead. Mm-hmm. And Phil came up with a kind of an environmental concept for Don't Stop the Music, which was far less pointed as I tend to write, because I've written quite a few environmental songs. So I think it's kind of, I've got more succinct in what I want to say. And weirdly, I heard it and said, I don't think this should be an environmental song. I think this should just be a song about, appreciating someone. And so I went away and, wrote some new word, and Phil and I exchanged some ideas, and Mike had some input, and it turned into this very uplifting track, which is just a great groove. And the groove has the most relationship with Greater Good, probably. It's like it's a Future Soul track. There is a bit of Future Soul in the album. And I think that that's a musical form that I've really been introduced to by my kids, who are not kids anymore. Right. But I like a lot of it. I like a lot of Future Soul. And so I think, what, maybe subconsciously there was a sense of me saying, can't do another heavy subject. This just needs to be lighter. But actually, it was the music that demanded it. The music said, I want to spread my wings here. I just want to celebrate.
Right.
And that's what really Don't Stop the Music is. It's very much a celebratory song about recognizing what two people have together.
I definitely can't wait to play this at a gathering at home. So
cool.
It's it's taken a lot of self-restraint to just sort of keep the song to myself all this time. It's not been easy. It's not been easy at all.
That's cool. That's cool.
But I really hope, Clark, you would consider that as a future single. I think it's fantastic. And it shouldn't be relegated to album track status at all, in my humble opinion.
Well, let me just say something to that, Pranav, and this won't surprise you at all. And that is that actually Don't Stop the Music has gone to radio over here.
Fantastic.
Alongside New Day Ahead. I mean, they're both really different tracks. But the thing is that any one of those songs can be a single. And I think this was actually true of Turn Back the Clock. It was true of Magnetized. It's kind of, in a way, how I write and how Mike produces and how we affect one another, because we're constantly pushing each other to go further. It's a great dynamic between the two of us that drives each other mad with one another sometimes. But I do recognize the fact that we up each other's game by working together. So I think practically every song on this album could be a single. But actually, in this day and age, that's literally true, isn't it? Because what is a single? Well, in a traditional sense, it's the song you go to radio and to TV. But if you don't have radio support or TV support, let's say, well, what is a single? It's the track that people find online through various means. So I can see through one way or another, Don't Stop the Music, as with any of them, will have their single status. But in terms of formal singles, I know what you mean. Let's see. Maybe it'll be for certain territories, not for others. And that could be true of the first two singles of, Spirit of Love and New Day Ahead. Who knows? I'm open. I'm open.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Now, Clark, Mike's studio wizardry on this album is on full display, and and I have a sense of what some of my favorite production moments on the album are. But I'm curious as to what is your favorite moment on this album that Mike was the sonic architect of.
Well, I have a feeling the song I'm going to mention is not your favorite, Pranav, and I say that chuckling because I'm very lighthearted about all this stuff. It's like it's at the end of the day, isn't it a joy that we're able to discuss these things? And you're doing what you're doing, I'm doing what I'm doing. When we came to do New Day Ahead, I had New Day Ahead pretty much as a complete song, and then it turned into this glam rock idea. And I had to. It was really important, but the album was getting quite R&B-ish because this is where me and Mike meet with the things we love most musically, although we then diverge and, Mike goes into one area and I go into another that we both kind of like. But in a way, the glam rock thing was something where we converged again because I grew up listening to bands like Sweet and T-Rex and early Bowie. And Mike, of course, was an engineer at Rack Studios in London, Rack being Mickey Most's label, Mickey Most being our former compatriot Calvin's father. Mickey was the great progenitor of glam rock. And, he produced Suzi Quatro, Muds, Hot Chocolate were not exactly glam rock, but he was very much in that moment of 70s British music history. And, I was signed to Rack Records. You couldn't help but kind of be affected by being at Rack Studios and knowing a lot of that history happened there. And I love the fact that glam made a brief comeback in the guise of Muse. And I went to see Muse. I took my son to see Muse, and I took my son and my daughter to see Muse, and when they were younger. And I love the fact that how tongue-in-cheek. They're very bombastic. They're great players, but there is something slightly tongue-in-cheek about it, and that's very much how Mike and I are in life. I take what I write about very seriously, but I thought, what? New Day Ahead, I knew already it was an environmental song. I'd written, the melody and the lyrics, but I just thought, wouldn't it be great if this was just an out-and-out glam rock track where you just did a lot of hand clapping and punching the air and having fun with it, because it's such a heavy subject that what we're doing to the planet is so crushing that in some ways the way to lift ourselves up is to say, what, we can do this and we can have a good time doing it. I remember Pete Townsend said that in an interview. He said, one of his motivations with being a rock and roll musician and writer is that, I'm going to talk about all these heavy subjects, and now let's dance. And I thought that was so cool. And Pete Townsend's one of the gods of music, so I really loved that concept. So this is my, again, slightly, I'm going around the houses here to say, when Mike recorded the guitar on that, and the guitarist is Marcus Bonfanti, who was the guitarist for a lot of the tracks on Magnetize, and he's our live guitarist. Marcus is a blues player, quite a bit younger than us, and he is the front person for what is left of the iconic 60s and 70s band 10 years after. But Marcus is really, I've worked with Marcus for donkey's years. He's very tight with us. And when we explained the concept, and it was Mike who really got the sound. And when I heard the sound and the guitar intro, I just said to him, Mike, that is genius. That sound is what this track is about. So Marcus's fantastic abilities as a player, married with Mike's amazing ability to take an idea, whether that's from me or someone else, and sonically understand how to recreate it or to create it from scratch, really, really got me. So I have to say, he'd probably be surprised that that's the moment I'm focusing on. But that particular element of New Day Ahead really blew me away. So I guess that's my favorite moment.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Now, coming to the end of the interview here, Clark, I'm gonna end my interview with something on the heavier side. And so I'd like to switch gears a little bit and move on to a broader question around music industry trends. Do you believe there's an ageist bias in the modern musical mainstream? And if so, what do you believe is a proactive measure to counteract this?
Yes, I think chart music is ageist.
Okay.
And chart music is by and large driven by the few remaining major labels there are. And their attitude, which you could argue has always been ageist. I mean, even in the heyday of record labels, and I certainly had more of an affinity with how they operated then, 70s, 80s than I do now. I think they feel like they're onto a good thing by a quick turnaround of artists who come and go, and the next legend is born, and then that legend suddenly disappears, and another legend is put in their place. And I'm using that that word legend very clearly because I think that word is bandied about way too often now. So I do think that they feel that they're going to sell to young people,
right?
And their focus therefore has to be on recognizing there's a point beyond which you can have arisen in music as a young person and then grow older and still be relevant and popular. And Madonna's a good example of that.
Of course.
But the idea of almost making a fresh start as an older person in popular music is pretty much a no-go. I think through streaming and social media, you can establish an audience, and we've seen that happen. But we're not talking about chart music here. We're talking about niche music.
Sure.
I'm now going to challenge myself with my prognosis about ageism, because I think it's true that music is intrinsically ageist. It's, in my humble opinion, and I could be shouted down for this, it's whatever element of racism is there, or gender bias, which I think is an issue as well, is far less influential on the course of music than ageism. I think often, here's a great example. It's not a very good example in a way, but Sting, one of my favorite Sting tracks is The Last Ship, the title track of the album. That is a brilliant piece of music, and it should be up there with Russians or Englishmen in New York or Message in a Bottle. It's fantastic. But I think that even Sting, who is, really deserving of the term legend, is now seen as old hat, not relevant. Actually, I would say psychologically and emotionally, spiritually, he's more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
So this is an odd thing, because an older person is usually a wiser person, and wiser people have something of greater value to say than when they're younger. And I think it's very convenient that young music is continued to be pushed forward as being the kind of the high point of musical evolution. I mean, I'm constantly reading this in the press that, this artist at this age is, breaking barriers and all the rest of it. And I'm thinking to myself, no, I don't think they are. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
As you get older, you break the barriers.
Sure.
So, okay, but that said, my son introduced me to synthwave, and in particular, a couple bands, The Midnight and FM84. And I posted on, I think I tweeted actually. I don't tweet very much. I do much more on Facebook, but I tweeted just how much I loved an FM84 track called Running in the Night. Mm-hmm. And I did that a while ago. Well, FM84 just found this tweet and were beside themselves that the guy who wrote Shattered Dreams, which was apparently, I didn't realize, was such an important song for them.
Yeah.
Just name checked them and spread the message. I did. I said, give this a listen. And that led to other people in the synthwave movement being included in these tweets. And suddenly I'm, The Midnight are brought into it, and Duet, and it's a really interesting world. And I thought to myself, what was very interesting is that they valued me, my journey. And I thought, actually, you know what? If the public can learn to value the idea that what a musician has to say in their older years is still rooted in the stuff that they love, the music that I made when I was younger, as an example. Actually, maybe this ageism can be turned around, and we can see it as all one thing, because the synthwave movement is something that I relate to now. Yeah. Well, these are younger people. They're not particularly young, but these are younger people making this music. And I relate to it at the age I'm at. And if I wanted to, at the click of a finger, because it's so natural to me, I could be in the synthwave world. So it made me realize that actually maybe it's specific genres that are going to help us break down these barriers. And often there's genres that are related to the genres that an older musician grew up being part of. Well, I was part of the electronic movement of the 80s.
Right.
So there is part of me that thinks that actually electronic movement, I mean, look at The Weeknd.
Yeah.
And how he's tapped into that maybe that's what will break down barriers. I don't know. I haven't arrived at a particular point with that, Pranav. I just think that it's made me realize that actually you can't compete with young people and the young person's game. When I was younger, recording that early Johnny Hates Jazz stuff with Mike and Calvin, an artist in their 40s or 50s couldn't compete with us. Forget it. We were it. But now I'm on the other side of the mirror, and I'm saying to myself, actually, those older artists should be able to compete, because they are going to up everyone's game, because they technically should be better at what they do than they've ever been, because they're just more refined and they have more to say for themselves, and they've learned a lot of lessons. And so I'm kind of hopeful. I think maybe through streaming, which I think has some terrible negatives for music, but I think through streaming, in a way, it might actually break down some barriers and allow ageism to become less relevant.
True. I mean, Clark, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, you talked about being able to compete with younger artists, and I feel there are two dimensions there. There is the celebrity dimension, and then there's the art dimension. And I think curators have a responsibility, at least in the art realm. I play your music alongside younger artists. I don't make a differentiation. So when a listener writes in and says, hey, I heard a song called Magnetized by this new band called Johnny Hates Jazz, the message I take is the age doesn't matter. In that realm, in this purely sonic musical realm, that distinction should not matter. So I think curators have a huge responsibility there, and I think exercising that responsibility is a choice.
I think that is brilliantly put. And how come it only took you about 15 seconds to say that, and it took me about 5 minutes to make my point? That's why you're a DJ and presenter and probably journalist as well, Pranav. And you know what? I often say to DJs, I don't know if is that a suitable term for you, Pranav?
It's a perfectly acceptable term, absolutely.
Okay. I often say to DJs, thank you. And I say thank you to radio in its many different forms. You've heard me say this before.
Of course.
Because you are in many ways our mouthpiece. You build the bridge between us and the listener. And yes, you can say social media does as well. Well, yeah, kind of, it does, yeah, but it's got other dimensions to it. What I love about radio in all its forms is that it's primarily about music. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, the curators, and in this case what we're talking about is DJs, but curators in general, I think, have a massive role to play. And I'm very, very appreciative, more than I've ever been actually, of the role they play in the communication process between us as the artists and the people. So thank you, Pranav. Thank you for what you're doing.
No, I appreciate the support. Now, I'm so glad both you and Mike are still doing This Is Johnny Hates Jazz. Like it is with many of your fans, my admiration for Johnny Hates Jazz started with the Turn Back the Clock album, and I think this new album, Wide Awake, truly builds on this legacy, and it really has me wondering what the two of you will do next. Honestly, thank you so much for being so incredibly generous with your time. I'm just glad that you guys are a part of the modern pop music landscape, and I'm glad that the term Johnny Hates Jazz is not just, something associated with a memory of the distant past.
Thank you, Pranav. I appreciate your words, and I feel the same. I think it's still very much a living, breathing entity, and has a long journey ahead still.
That's so good to hear. I think of both of you as sort of the luxury brand of pop music, so you have to keep that going.
Thank you. That's very cool. Thank you very much, Pranav. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Clark. Really wishing you the absolute best with this album. I hope it does well for both of you. I can't wait to play a bunch of these songs. I mean, right now, the only one that's on high rotation is Spirit of Love. I'm itching to play Don't Stop the Music, and hopefully I will do that very, very soon.
Cool, man. That's great. Thank you so much, Pranav. Good to speak again.
Likewise, Clark. Take care. Stay safe.
You too, man. All right. Bye for now.
Bye.
Cheers.